You should know what happened this 1871 and why it is one of the most dramatic and consequential disasters in American history. The Great Chicago Fire. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Picture it, the year is 1871 and Chicago is on fire, literally and figuratively. This is not just any blaze. This is the inferno that would consume a city, kill hundreds, leave 100,000 people homeless in a single night, and yet in the ashes plant the seeds for modern America's skyline. We're about to walk through every moment of that Sunday evening and the terrifying days that followed, hour by hour, block by block, as if we're standing on the wooden sidewalks ourselves, feeling the heat on our faces and the panic rising in our chests. This is the story of the Great Chicago Fire, not a legend, but the raw, heartbreaking, awe-inspiring truth. Let's set the stage properly, because to understand why the fire became the monster it did, you have to understand the city it devoured. By 1871, Chicago had transformed itself in barely 40 years from a muddy frontier outpost on the shores of Lake Michigan into the undisputed transportation and commercial capital of the American Midwest. The population had exploded from a few hundred in the 1830s to more than 334,000 souls. Railroads converged here like spokes on a wheel, more than a dozen lines hauling grain, lumber, cattle, and manufactured goods from every direction. The stockyards on the south side were already legendary. The phrase "hog butcher for the world" was just around the corner. Immigrants poured in by the tens of thousands, Irish, Germans, Scandinavians, Poles, filling neighborhoods with wooden cottages, tenements, and factories. The downtown, known as the Loop even then, boasted 5- and 6-story buildings with ornate facades, grand hotels like the Sherman House and the Palmer House still under construction, banks, theaters, newspaper offices, and department stores. It was a city on the make, ambitious, noisy, and crucially, almost entirely built of wood. Wood was everywhere. The sidewalks were pine planks. The streets were paved with wooden blocks soaked in coal tar. The buildings themselves, even the most impressive ones, had wooden frames, wooden floors, wooden roofs, and often wooden ornamentation. Fire insurance maps from the period show block after block of frame construction. Brick and stone existed, but they were the exception, mostly in the very center. The rest of the city was a giant wooden tinderbox stretching for miles in every direction. And nature had been conspiring against Chicago for months. The summer and fall of 1871 had been brutally dry. From July through early October, rainfall was less than half the normal amount. The prairie grasses and forests surrounding the city were parched. Small fires had broken out almost every week in the lumber yards along the river, in the shanty towns, even in the downtown itself. The Chicago Fire Department, one of the best equipped in the nation with steam engines and horse-drawn apparatus, was exhausted. Firefighters had been battling blazes for weeks with almost no rest. Their horses were worn out, their hoses were patched and leaky, their men were running on adrenaline and coffee. On the evening of Saturday, October 7, a fire had ripped through a 4-block area on the west side near the gasworks. It took 16 hours to bring it under control. The men were dead on their feet. By Sunday afternoon, October 8, the temperature still hovered in the high 70s. A warm, dry wind was blowing hard out of the southwest, exactly the wrong direction for a city built on the lake's edge. The wind would act like a bellows, pushing flames northeast toward the heart of the city and the lake. But no one knew that yet. Families were enjoying what was left of the weekend. Church services had just ended. People were sitting on front stoops, children playing in the streets, saloons doing brisk business. In the O'Leary neighborhood on the west side, a working-class Irish enclave of small cottages and barns, life felt ordinary. DeKoven Street, just south of 12th Street and west of the South Branch of the Chicago River, was typical narrow, lined with wooden cottages, outhouses, and barns. At 137 DeKoven Street lived Patrick and Catherine O'Leary, Irish immigrants with 5 children. Patrick worked as a laborer. Catherine sold milk from their 5 cows kept in a small barn behind the house. The barn was a simple wooden structure, maybe 20 by 30 feet, filled with hay, straw, and a little kerosene for the lamps. Next door lived the McLaughlins, across the alley the Daltons and the Sullivans. It was a tight-knit, poor but proud community. Sometime around 8:30 or 9:00 p.m. on Sunday night, the exact minute is still debated, a fire started inside the O'Leary barn. We will never know the true cause with absolute certainty. The famous story everyone still repeats, that Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern while she was milking, was almost certainly invented by a reporter the next day and repeated so often it became gospel. Catherine O'Leary always insisted she was already in bed, the cows had been milked earlier, and no lantern had been left in the barn. Later investigations pointed to other possibilities. A neighbor boy named Daniel Pegleg Sullivan, who said he was in the barn checking on a friend's calf and may have dropped a pipe or match, spontaneous combustion in the dry hay, even a spark from a passing train on the nearby tracks. Some wilder theories at the time blamed a meteor shower from Biela's comet, which had broken up and was passing overhead. The same night, the even deadlier Peshtigo fire erupted 250 miles north in Wisconsin, and fires broke out in Michigan and Iowa. But the comet theory has been thoroughly debunked by modern science. The simple truth is that in a city full of open flames, candles, oil lamps, coal stoves, cigars, on a night when everything was bone dry and the wind was howling, a fire was almost inevitable somewhere. What we do know is this: the fire began small, probably in the hay piled at the rear of the barn. Within minutes, flames were licking up the wooden walls. A neighbor, Mrs. McLaughlin, spotted the glow and screamed fire. Daniel Sullivan, who lived nearby and had a wooden leg, claimed he ran into the barn to try to save the animals and barely escaped with his life. Someone, possibly one of the O'Leary children, ran to the nearest fire alarm box at the corner of DeKoven and Jefferson. But here the tragedy compounds. The watchman in the fire lookout tower on the courthouse cupola, Matthias Schaffer, saw the glow to the southwest but misjudged its location. He thought it was the remnants of Saturday night's fire still smoldering near the gasworks. He sent engine company number 6, the closest unit, to the wrong address a full mile away. Precious minutes ticked by. By the time the mistake was realized and the engines rerouted, the barn was an inferno and the flames had already jumped to the O'Leary house and the neighboring cottages. The wind was now a gale, gusting up to 30 miles an hour. Embers the size of baseballs were being carried hundreds of feet through the air. Wooden shingles ignited on rooftops blocks away. The fire began its deadly march northeast. Within 20 minutes, the entire block between DeKoven and Taylor was ablaze. Families poured into the streets clutching babies, dragging trunks, screaming for help. Cows and horses broke loose and ran wild. The heat was already so intense that paint blistered on houses 2 blocks distant. The first firefighters on scene, exhausted from the night before, fought valiantly, but the water pressure was low, the hoses too short, and the wind too strong. They tried to create fire breaks by dynamiting buildings, but the explosions only scattered more burning debris. It was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a garden hose. By 10:30 p.m., the fire had crossed 12th Street and was racing toward the south branch of the Chicago River. People still believed the river would act as a natural barrier. After all, water doesn't burn right. But they had forgotten about the lumber yards, coal yards, and wooden warehouses lining both banks. Flames leaped the river on burning planks and tar-covered roofs carried by the wind. The gasworks at the river's edge exploded in a spectacular fireball that lit up the sky for miles. Now the fire had a new fuel source, thousands of cubic feet of coal gas, and nothing could stop it. Let's pause for a moment and imagine the scene from the perspective of an ordinary Chicagoan that night. You're a young clerk living in a boarding house on Lake Street downtown. You step outside after supper because you hear church bells ringing, the city's fire alarm system. The sky to the southwest is glowing orange. At first you think it's just another small blaze. Then you hear the roar, a sound like 1,000 freight trains coming at once. The wind is so strong it rips hats off heads and tears awnings from storefronts. People are starting to run. Someone shouts that the west side is gone. You don't believe it until you see the first embers falling like red snow on the roof of the Tremont House Hotel across the street. The panic is instantaneous. Hotel's empty. Theaters let out mid-performance. Saloons are abandoned mid-drink. Women in evening gowns and men in top hats mingle with factory workers and immigrants in the streets, all heading east toward the lake, the only place that might be safe. Meanwhile, back at the fire's origin, the O'Leary family had lost everything in minutes. Catherine O'Leary would later tell reporters she stood in the alley watching her life burn and said only, "I have lost everything, but I have my children." The family would be vilified for decades, hounded by the press, forced to move and change their names. Cow's story would follow them to their graves, but the fire didn't care about blame. It had tasted the city and it was hungry. By 11:15 p.m., the flames had reached the heart of the south side. The gasworks explosion had sent a pillar of fire hundreds of feet into the air. The wooden bridges across the south branch ignited like matches. The fire now had three fronts, one racing north along the river, one pushing east toward the downtown, and one spreading south into the working-class neighborhoods. The heat was so intense that stone buildings cracked, iron twisted, and marble melted. People who tried to cross the river found the water itself boiling in places from the falling debris. The Chicago Tribune building, supposedly fireproof, caught fire when embers landed on its wooden roof. The paper's own pressmen kept the presses running until the last possible second, printing an extra edition that read, "The entire city is on fire." Then they fled. Let's talk about the human cost in those first hours, because the stories are almost too heartbreaking to bear. A mother carrying her infant tried to cross a burning bridge and both disappeared into the river. An entire family of 8 was trapped in their attic when the staircase collapsed. Neighbors heard their screams until the roof fell in. A priest at St. Patrick's Church stayed behind to ring the bell, warning people to flee, until the steeple itself crashed down around him. Firefighters from Engine Company 5 were cut off by the flames and had to abandon their steam engine. They watched it melt into a puddle of iron. The wind was now clocked at over 40 miles per hour in gusts. It sounded like a hurricane. The sky turned from orange to blood red to black as smoke blotted out the stars. By midnight, the fire had crossed the main branch of the Chicago River and was devouring the north side. The waterworks, the massive stone building that pumped the city's entire water supply, stood directly in its path. If the waterworks fell, the fire department would have no pressure at all. The chief, Robert Williams, ordered every available engine to defend it. They pumped lake water directly onto the roof while the building's own wooden interior burned from the inside. For a brief, heroic moment, it seemed they might save it. Then the roof collapsed. The giant pumps went silent. The city's water supply was gone. From that moment on, the fire was unstoppable. The exodus had become a stampede. Tens of thousands of people streamed toward Lake Michigan. They waded into the shallows up to their necks, holding children above the waves. Others crammed onto boats and barges that were themselves on fire. The air was so hot that people's clothes smoked. The noise was indescribable, the roar of the flames, the crash of collapsing buildings, the screams of people and animals, the constant explosion of gas mains and whiskey barrels in the warehouses. One survivor later wrote, "It was as if the gates of hell had opened and the devil himself was loose in Chicago." As the clock struck 1 a.m. on Monday, October 9, the fire reached the heart of the downtown. The magnificent Palmer House Hotel, brand new and advertised as completely fireproof, burned to the ground in less than an hour. The courthouse bell tower, the same one from which the first alarm had been misjudged, caught fire. The great bell crashed to the ground with a final mournful clang that could be heard for miles. The post office, the custom house, the banks on LaSalle Street, all gone. The streets themselves burned. The wooden block pavement turned into rivers of liquid fire. People ran down Randolph Street with their hair on fire. The heat was so great that it created its own weather, fire whirls, tornadoes of flame that picked up entire buildings and flung them through the air. Yet even in this nightmare, there were moments of astonishing courage and kindness. A bookseller named Elias Colbert stayed in his store until the last minute, handing out free books to anyone who would carry them to safety. A young woman named Claire Innes, just 17, led a group of children through the flames to the lake and kept them alive by wrapping them in wet blankets. Immigrant families shared their last loaves of bread with strangers. The rich and the poor, the native-born and the newly arrived, were suddenly equal in the face of the Inferno. By 2 a.m., the fire had jumped the main river and was racing up the north side, devouring the mansions along Michigan Avenue and the shanties of the poor with equal fury. The wind was still howling, the sky was a solid sheet of flame. More than 2 square miles of the city were already destroyed. The death toll was climbing into the hundreds, and the fire showed no sign of slowing down. This is where we must pause our story for now, right at the moment when Chicago's fate hangs by a thread and the worst is still to come. The flames are marching toward the north side mansions and the last pockets of resistance. The waterworks has fallen. The city is without water, without leadership, and without hope. But in the darkness and the smoke, a few brave souls are already planning how to rise again. That, my friends, is only the beginning of one of the most dramatic and consequential disasters in American history. When you're ready, tell me to continue with part 2, and we will pick up exactly here, the long night turning into the deadliest day Chicago has ever known. Subscribe, comment where you're watching from, and I'll see you in the next chapter of the Great Chicago Fire. The long night turning into the deadliest day Chicago has ever known brought no relief. As the clock passed 2 a.m. on Monday, October 9, 1871, the Inferno had already claimed the north side in a single unstoppable wave. With the waterworks reduced to a smoking ruin, every hydrant in the city ran dry. Firefighters stood helpless beside their silent steam engines, axes dangling uselessly at their sides, watching neighborhoods they had sworn to protect disappear in walls of flame 30 stories high. The wind, still screaming out of the southwest at gale force, hurled firebrands the size of wagon wheels across entire avenues. Michigan Avenue itself became a corridor of hell, its grand limestone mansions exploding one after another as the wooden interiors ignited like kindling. In the Gold Coast district, where Chicago's wealthiest families lived in brownstone palaces overlooking the lake, the panic reached its peak. Carriages that had once carried opera-goers now careened wildly through the streets, trunks and pianos lashed to the roofs, horses foaming at the mouth. Potter Palmer, the hotel magnate whose new Palmer house had already burned to the ground downtown, stood in the doorway of his Michigan Avenue mansion directing servants to save what they could. His wife Bertha later recalled clutching her jewelry box and a single silver tea service while the roof above her caught fire. They escaped with minutes to spare. Behind them, the entire block collapsed in a roar that sounded like 1,000 cannons firing at once. Further north, in the shanty towns and immigrant enclaves near Lincoln Park, the scene was even more desperate. Families who had nothing but the clothes on their backs fled on foot, mothers carrying babies, fathers dragging elderly parents on makeshift sleds. One survivor described seeing an old German woman sitting calmly on her front steps reading her Bible by the light of her burning house until the heat finally drove her away. The fire created its own terrifying weather system. Superheated air rose thousands of feet, sucking in cooler lake breezes and spawning fire tornadoes, rotating columns of flame that danced through the streets, lifting entire rooftops and flinging them blocks away. People caught in the open felt their lungs scorch with every breath. Clothing burst into flames from radiant heat alone. Those who reached Lake Michigan waded out until the water reached their chins, holding children above the waves while sparks fell like rain around them. Some never made it. A young mother named Julia Limos, widowed just weeks earlier, carried her 4 small children through the burning streets. When the crowd surged onto a wooden bridge that ignited beneath their feet, she lost 2 of them to the river before dragging the survivors to safety on a sandbar. Her story would later become legend, but in that moment there was only terror and the desperate prayer that the lake itself would not boil. By 4 a.m. the destruction had reached a scale almost beyond comprehension. 4 square miles of the city, everything from the river to Fullerton Avenue, was either burning or already gone. The famous Water Tower, that sturdy limestone castle on Chicago Avenue, stood miraculously untouched amid the sea of flames. Built of thick Joliet marble with a 138-foot standpipe inside, it refused to fall even as wooden buildings on every side collapsed. Firefighters who had given up everywhere else gathered there in a last symbolic stand, pumping what little lake water they could directly onto its walls. Crowds of refugees huddled in its shadow, convinced that if the tower survived, perhaps Chicago itself might still have a future. Years later, people would call it a miracle, but in truth it was simple engineering, stone and iron that the wooden city around it lacked. As dawn broke, the sky remained black with smoke. The sun rose somewhere behind the pall, casting an eerie blood-red light over the ruins. Yet the fire showed no sign of slowing. It had now jumped the north branch of the river and was racing into the open prairie beyond the city limits. Farmers in Evanston and Wilmette watched the horizon glow and began plowing fire breaks with whatever teams of horses they could muster. In the city itself, the first signs of organized resistance appeared. Mayor Roswell Mason, who had slept through the initial hours, finally reached the courthouse ruins and declared martial law. General Philip Sheridan, the Civil War hero stationed at Fort Sheridan just north of the city, marched troops into the streets with orders to shoot looters on sight. Soldiers in blue uniforms formed human chains to pass buckets of lake water hand to hand, while others used gunpowder to blast fire breaks along Clark Street and La Salle. The explosions added their own thunder to the chaos, but for the first time the fire met something resembling opposition. Still, Monday morning brought fresh horrors. The lumber district along the river, miles of stacked pine boards dried by months of drought, ignited in a single apocalyptic burst. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air, visible from 50 miles away. The heat was so intense that iron rails on the railroad tracks twisted into pretzels. Warehouses full of whiskey and coal oil exploded in chains of fireballs that rained burning liquid onto fleeing crowds. One such blast near the Ogden Slip sent a wave of flaming whiskey rolling down the street like a river of lava, trapping dozens of people who had sought refuge in a nearby stable. Their screams were lost in the roar. Amid the devastation, extraordinary acts of humanity shone through. A Catholic priest named Father Michael W. Conway stayed at his parish on the north side until the last parishioner had fled, then walked through the flames carrying the blessed sacrament to safety. A Jewish merchant named Henry Greenebaum opened his safe and handed out thousands of dollars in cash to anyone who promised to use it for relief. Streetcar drivers who had lost their own homes kept their cars running as free shuttles, ferrying the injured to the lakefront. And in the midst of it all, a group of newspaper reporters from the Chicago Tribune, whose building had burned early Sunday night, commandeered a printing press in a surviving barn in Lincoln Park, and somehow produced a single-sheet extra edition headlined Chicago and RUINS. They distributed it free to refugees, the ink still wet, telling the world what was happening even as the city died around them. By noon on Monday, the fire had consumed nearly everything in its path. The north side was a smoking wasteland stretching from the river to the prairie. Only a few scattered stone structures, the water tower, the Chicago Avenue pumping station, and St. Michael's Church with its thick brick walls, remained standing like lonely sentinels. The death toll, though still uncounted, was climbing into the hundreds. Bodies lay in the streets where people had simply collapsed from heat and exhaustion. Others were found huddled in root cellars, suffocated when the oxygen was sucked away by the flames. The smell of burning pine, coal, and worse hung over everything. Yet something remarkable was beginning to happen even while the fire still raged. In the refugee camps along the lake shore, where over 100,000 people now huddled under whatever blankets or tarps they could find, conversations turned from survival to rebuilding. A young architect named Louis Sullivan, only 25 years old and newly arrived in the city, walked the burning streets taking mental notes. He would later say the fire revealed the lie of the old wooden city and showed him the future, steel frames and fireproof construction. Businessmen whose fortunes had literally gone up in smoke began sketching plans on the backs of envelopes for a new Chicago taller and stronger than before. Mayor Mason met with civic leaders in a makeshift headquarters at a surviving railroad depot and vowed that the city would rise again before winter set in. The fire, however, was not finished. It continued to smolder and flare throughout the afternoon, pushing north into the suburbs and threatening the vast prairie that fed the city's grain trade. Exhausted firefighters, many of whom had not slept in 48 hours, rotated in and out of the lines, their faces black with soot, their uniforms in tatters. Soldiers patrolled the ruins, their rifles at the ready, stopping looters who tried to steal from abandoned stores. One notorious gang was caught trying to roll a safe out of a burned bank. They were arrested at gunpoint and marched away through the ashes. As the long afternoon wore on, the wind finally began to shift, turning from the deadly southwest to a gentler breeze off the lake. The change was slight at first, barely noticeable amid the roar, but it mattered. Embers no longer flew as far. The fire's own fury started to work against it, consuming its fuel faster than the wind could spread it. By late Monday evening, as the sky finally began to darken with real night instead of smoke, scattered showers started to fall, not yet the downpour the city needed, but enough to dampen the edges of the Inferno. Men who had fought for 24 straight hours lifted their faces to the rain and wept openly. The worst was not over. The fire would burn in pockets for another full day, but for the first time since Sunday night, Chicago could glimpse the possibility of survival. The city had lost nearly a third of its buildings, its entire business district, and thousands of homes, yet its people were already refusing to surrender. In the flickering light of the dying flames, they began to organize. Relief trains were already being loaded in Milwaukee and St. Louis. Telegrams had gone out to every major city in America asking for help, and in the hearts of those who had lost everything, a fierce new determination was taking root. Tuesday, October 10, 1871, arrived under a sky that was no longer glowing red, but instead hung low and gray, choked with the last lingering columns of smoke that rose like funeral pyres from the still smoldering heart of what had once been the Queen City of the West. The gentle rain that had begun in the pre-dawn hours continued its merciful work, turning the vast sea of ashes into a sodden black paste that sucked at the boots of every exhausted soul who dared to walk through the ruins. It was not a dramatic downpour with thunder and lightning. It was something quieter, more persistent, a steady drizzle that hissed and steamed whenever it touched a pocket of white-hot embers buried beneath collapsed walls. Firefighters, their faces streaked with grime and their uniforms hanging in tatters, stood motionless for the first time in nearly 40 hours, watching the rain do what their empty hoses and weary horses could not. One veteran engine captain from Engine Company 14 later wrote in his diary that the sound of those raindrops was the most beautiful music he had ever heard, because it meant the monster had finally been slain. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the last major flames had been declared under control. What remained were thousands of individual hot spots, cellars where coal had been stored, piles of lumber that had fused into glassy slag, and the skeletal frames of iron-fronted buildings whose wooden interiors still glowed faintly like dying coals in a hearth. Patrols of soldiers and civilian volunteers moved methodically through the wasteland, armed with buckets and shovels, dousing anything that flickered. The Chicago Fire Department, now bolstered by fresh crews who had ridden all night on relief trains from Milwaukee, Cincinnati, Louisville, and even as far as Pittsburgh, began the slow process of recovering their equipment. Steam engines that had melted into twisted lumps of metal were dragged away. Hoses that had burned to brittle ash were cataloged for replacement. The city's water supply, cut off when the great pumping station fell, was slowly being restored by emergency connections to the lake. Men worked in shifts, their hands raw and blistered, knowing that every hour without water meant more danger of disease among the refugees. And the refugees, oh, the sheer human tide of them. More than 100,000 people, nearly one-third of Chicago's entire population, had been rendered homeless in a single night. They huddled in makeshift camps along the lakefront from Randolph Street north to Lincoln Park, a 4-mile stretch of shoreline turned into the largest outdoor shelter in American history. Some had tents salvaged from the army, most had nothing but the clothes on their backs, soaked now by the rain. Mothers cradled infants under sodden blankets while fathers stood guard over small piles of salvaged belongings, a blackened Bible, a single silver spoon, a child's doll with its hair singed away. The smell of wet ash and unwashed bodies mixed with the faint, acrid scent of scorched pine that still clung to everything. Yet even in this misery there was order. Volunteer committees organized soup kitchens using cauldrons borrowed from surviving restaurants. Bread arrived by the wagon load from bakeries on the unburned South Side. Women from the Chicago Relief and Aid Society moved among the crowds with notebooks, recording names, ages, and needs, promising that no one would go hungry while help was on the way. The scale of the destruction, now visible in the cold light of day, was almost beyond human comprehension. When surveyors and insurance adjusters finally walked the lines, they counted 17,450 buildings gone: homes, factories, churches, schools, theaters, banks, everything. 3 1/3 square miles of the city, an area larger than the entire island of Manhattan at the time, had been reduced to smoking rubble. The financial loss was estimated at $200 million in 1871 currency, an amount equal to nearly $5 billion today. More than 300 people were confirmed dead, though many believed the true number was closer to 400 because so many bodies had simply vanished into the Inferno, consumed entirely by temperatures that reached 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The dead were found in the most heartbreaking poses, families huddled together in root cellars, their arms still wrapped around one another, a priest clutching a crucifix at the altar of a burned-out church, a young couple who had tried to shield each other on a rooftop until the roof itself collapsed. Identification was often impossible. Bodies were wrapped in whatever cloth could be found and laid out in long rows at temporary morgues near the lake. Clergymen of every denomination moved among them, offering prayers while families searched desperately for missing loved ones. Yet even as the city counted its dead, the living refused to surrender. At 10 o'clock that morning, Mayor Roswell B. Mason stood on the steps of a surviving railroad depot on the South Side and read a proclamation that would be reprinted in every newspaper in America within 24 hours. "The fire is out," he declared in a voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "Chicago still lives. Let the nation know that we ask for no charity, but only for the tools to rebuild our city with our own hands." His words were carried by telegraph to every major city in the country within minutes. The response was immediate and overwhelming. From New York came a train loaded with $100,000 in cash and carloads of clothing. Boston sent $300,000 and entire carloads of lumber. Cincinnati forwarded 50,000 barrels of flour and pork. London, Paris, and Berlin cabled contributions totaling more than $1 million. The Chicago Relief and Aid Society, already organized before the fire, became the most efficient disaster relief operation the world had ever seen. Within 48 hours, they had distributed 20,000 blankets, 15,000 pairs of shoes, and enough food to feed 100,000 people 3 meals a day. They established a massive warehouse on the lakefront where refugees could line up and receive clothing, cooking utensils, and even small sums of money to begin again. Stories of individual courage and tragedy poured out of the ruins like water from a broken dam. There was the tale of Claire Innes, the 17-year-old girl who had led 20 children through the flames to the lake on Sunday night, wrapping them in wet shawls and singing hymns to keep them calm while embers fell around them like fiery snow. She emerged unscathed and spent the next 3 days nursing the injured in the camps. There was Patrick and Catherine O'Leary, the couple whose barn had started it all, now living in a makeshift tent on the west side, shunned by many who still believed the cow story. Catherine sat silently, rocking her youngest child, while Patrick told anyone who would listen that they had lost 5 cows, their home, and their reputation, but not their dignity. Daniel Pegleg Sullivan, the one-legged neighbor who had first raised the alarm, limped through the ruins on his wooden leg, helping to carry the injured and swearing that he would never again smoke a pipe near hay. A German immigrant named August Schlosser, who had lost his entire family, stood on a street corner playing his violin for hours, the music drifting over the camps and giving people something to hold onto besides despair. Martial law remained in effect, enforced by General Philip Sheridan's troops who patrolled the ruins with fixed bayonets. Looters were shot on sight and 22 were killed in the first 3 days. One gang of thieves was caught trying to pry open the vault of the burned-out First National Bank using stolen dynamite. They were marched away in chains while crowds cheered. Yet for every story of crime there were 10 of generosity. A wealthy merchant named Marshall Field, whose store had been completely destroyed, opened what remained of his warehouse and gave away every bolt of cloth and pair of boots he could find. Potter Palmer, whose Palmer House Hotel was a smoking crater, personally financed the construction of temporary barracks for 5,000 homeless. A young bookseller named Elias Colbert, who had handed out free books during the fire, now organized a makeshift library in a tent, telling children that knowledge was the one thing the fire could never burn. By Wednesday morning, October 11, the rain had stopped and the sun broke through for the first time in days, revealing a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon, charred tree trunks standing like sentinels, streets buried under 2 feet of debris, and the occasional stone chimney rising like a lonely monument to what had been. Surveyors began marking out the old street lines with string and stakes. Carpenters from the unburned districts arrived with hammers and saws, ready to erect temporary wooden shanties so businesses could reopen. Within a week, more than 200 makeshift stores were operating along the lakefront, selling everything from nails to bread. The Chicago Tribune, whose building had been among the first to fall, published its first post-fire edition on October 11 from a borrowed press in a barn in Lincoln Park. The headline read simply, "Chicago shall rise again." The paper sold out in minutes. As the immediate crisis eased, the deeper conversations about the future began. In a series of emergency meetings held in a surviving warehouse on the South Side, the city's leading businessmen, architects, and politicians gathered around makeshift tables lit by kerosene lamps. Among them was a 25-year-old draftsman named Louis Sullivan, newly arrived from Boston, who walked the ruins every day with a sketchbook, noting how the fire had exposed the fatal weakness of wooden construction. There was William LeBaron Jenney, a Civil War veteran and engineer who had already been experimenting with iron beams. He quietly told colleagues that the fire had proved his theories correct and that the future belonged to steel and glass. Daniel Burnham and John Wellborn Root, 2 young partners just starting their careers, stood on the ashes of the old business district and vowed to create buildings that would touch the sky. They spoke of fireproofing, of elevators, of skeletons of steel that could rise 10, 15, 20 stories without fear. These conversations, held amid the smell of wet ash and the sound of hammers already ringing in the distance, marked the birth of what the world would later call the Chicago School of Architecture, the movement that would give America its first skyscrapers and change the face of cities forever. The nation watched in awe. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco carried daily dispatches. Poets wrote verses about Chicago's phoenix-like rise. Politicians in Washington debated federal aid, though Chicago proudly refused most of it, insisting it would rebuild on its own terms. By the end of the first week, more than 50,000 people had already returned to work clearing debris. Railroads that had been spared brought in carloads of lumber from Michigan and Wisconsin, the very forests that had supplied the original city. Brick kilns in the suburbs operated around the clock. Stone quarries in Joliet and Lemont resumed shipments. The sound of construction became the new heartbeat of the city, yet the emotional scars ran deep. Survivors gathered each evening around bonfires on the lakefront to share stories, to sing hymns, to remember the dead. Children who had lost everything played games among the ruins, using charred bricks as building blocks for imaginary new homes. Old men sat on overturned barrels and spoke of how the fire had leveled not just buildings, but old grudges, old class divisions, old ways of doing things. In the words of one Irish laborer who had lost his home on Decoven Street, the fire took everything, but it gave us something better, a chance to start clean. The city that had been born in mud and ambition was about to be reborn in steel and dreams. and the story of that rebirth of the architects and visionaries who would turn tragedy into triumph is the next chapter in this epic tale. By the middle of October 1871, less than 10 days after the last ember had been drowned by rain, the physical labor of clearing Chicago's ruins had already reached industrial proportions. Teams of men, many of them the same Irish and German laborers who had built the original wooden city, worked dawn to dusk with picks, shovels, wheelbarrows, and horse-drawn carts. They hauled away mountains of charred debris, loading it onto flat cars that ran day and night along hastily repaired rail lines. The refuse was dumped into the lake to extend the shoreline, creating new land that would later become Grant Park and the foundations of Michigan Avenue's second life. Every cartload that vanished into the water was a small act of erasure, but also a promise of renewal. The lake, which had saved so many lives by offering refuge, was now quietly swallowing the old Chicago to make room for the new. In the burned district itself, the streets were being reborn block by block. Carpenters erected one-story wooden shanties overnight. Merchants moved in before the roofs were finished. By October 20, more than 300 temporary stores were operating along State, Dearborn, and Clark streets. Signs painted on boards announced business as usual, even as customers stepped over piles of ash to enter. A dry goods dealer named Levi Later opened a canvas tent on Lake Street and sold every bolt of cloth he could get his hands on within 48 hours. Marshall Field, his former partner, did the same a block away. The two men, who had lost millions in inventory, shook hands in the street amid the smell of fresh lumber and said simply, "We'll build bigger next time." That handshake would later be remembered as the moment Chicago's retail empire was quietly reborn. The Chicago Relief and Aid Society continued its astonishing work. By the end of the month, they had distributed more than 5 million meals, housed 60,000 people in temporary barracks, and provided clothing, bedding, stoves, and tools to nearly every family that had lost a home. The Society's ledgers preserved today in the Chicago History Museum read like a census of courage. Mrs. Mary O'Toole, widow, 5 children, blanket, stove, $25 cash. Mr. Hans Mueller, carpenter, tools, lumber, family of 7, tent. Miss Eliza Thompson, seamstress, sewing machine salvaged from fire, thread, $10. Donations poured in from around the world. Queen Victoria sent a personal check for $5,000. The Sultan of Turkey forwarded money collected from his subjects. Schoolchildren in Edinburgh sent their pocket money. Chicagoans accepted every gift with gratitude but never with subservience. The dominant mood was not pity but defiance. A popular song sung around campfires captured it perfectly. "Chicago, Chicago, that toddlin' town burned to the ground, but she won't stay down." Meanwhile, the legal and political machinery of the city ground forward with surprising speed. Insurance companies faced claims totaling more than $100 million, far more than many of them could pay. Some firms went bankrupt overnight, others paid pennies on the dollar, yet the courts moved swiftly to settle disputes. Judges held sessions in tents and surviving saloons. One famous case involved a policyholder who had insured his stock of whiskey under goods on hand. The company argued that whiskey was a liquid, not goods. The judge ruled for the claimant, declaring that in Chicago, whiskey is always goods. The decision was cheered in every tavern that still stood. At the same time, the city council passed the first post-fire building ordinances. Wood was banned as a construction material in the central business district. Roofs had to be covered with slate, tin, or iron. Party walls between buildings were required to be brick at least 12 inches thick and to extend 2 feet above the roof line as fire breaks. These rules, modest by today's standards, were revolutionary in 1871. They forced builders to think in terms of permanence rather than speed. The era of the balloon frame wooden house, which had allowed Chicago to grow so rapidly in the first place, was officially over in the heart of the city. It was in this atmosphere of enforced reinvention that the architects began to dream aloud. William LeBaron Jenney, already in his late 30s and respected as an engineer, returned from a trip to Europe shortly after the fire with fresh ideas about iron construction. He had studied the great iron and glass structures of the Paris Universal Exposition of 1867 and the new department stores of Paris and London. Back in Chicago, he opened an office and began sketching buildings that used iron columns and beams to carry the weight, allowing the exterior walls to be nothing more than curtains of brick or stone. His first major commission after the fire was the later building on Wells Street, completed in 1873, a 5-story structure with iron columns spaced 20 feet apart and enormous plate glass windows. It was not yet a skyscraper, but it was a declaration. The future would be open, bright, and tall. Daniel Burnham and John Wellborn Root, the young partnership that would eventually dominate Chicago architecture, were just 25 and 27 years old when the fire struck. They had met only a few years earlier and were still sharing a small drafting room. In the weeks after the disaster, they walked the ruins together almost daily, sketching, measuring, arguing. Root was the artist, intuitive, brilliant at proportion and ornament, while Burnham was the organizer, the one who could talk to clients and get buildings built. Together they won their first important post-fire commission, the Montauk Block on Monroe Street, completed in 1882 but conceived in the ashes of 1871. It used brick-bearing walls thickened at the base to support additional floors, a simple but effective way to gain height without iron skeletons. They called it the Montauk after a Native American word meaning, "he has gone far." The name was prophetic. Louis Sullivan, the 25-year-old draftsman who had arrived in Chicago just before the fire, found work in the office of William LeBaron Jenney almost immediately after the disaster. He spent his days detailing iron columns and his nights studying the ruins, trying to understand why some buildings had survived while others had vanished. Sullivan was already obsessed with the idea that form follows function, a phrase he would later make famous. He saw in the fire's selectivity a lesson. Beauty and strength were not ornaments added after the fact, they had to be inherent in the structure itself. His early sketches from this period show tall, narrow buildings with vertical lines emphasized, windows grouped in vertical bands, and ornament restrained but rich. Those sketches would mature over the next decade into masterpieces like the Wainwright Building in St. Louis and the Chicago Stock Exchange, but their DNA was formed in the weeks after October 1871. By the spring of 1872, the building boom was in full swing. More than 10,000 new structures rose in the first year after the fire. Brick yards on the south side operated 24 hours a day, their kilns glowing like miniature versions of the disaster they were repairing. Stone from Joliet arrived by the trainload. Iron foundries cast columns and beams faster than they could be delivered. Elevators, still a novelty in 1871, became standard in taller buildings. Hydraulic lifts powered by city water pressure allowed structures to reach 7, 8, even 10 stories without fear of collapse. The word skyscraper had not yet been coined in its modern sense, but Chicagoans were already using it to describe anything taller than 5 stories. A local newspaper joked in 1873 that a building was now considered a skyscraper if you had to look up to spit on its roof. The economic miracle was as astonishing as the architectural one. Despite the loss of so much property, Chicago's population actually grew in the years immediately after the fire. People arrived by the thousands, drawn by the promise of work and the certainty that the city would not stand still. Immigrants who had been planning to settle elsewhere rerouted to Chicago because they heard there were jobs for anyone willing to swing a hammer. By 1880, the population had doubled to more than 500,000. The stockyards expanded, the grain elevators multiplied, the railroads added new lines. The city's geographic position at the center of the continent, where east met west like met rail, proved more valuable than ever. The fire had destroyed buildings, but it had not destroyed location. Culturally, too, Chicago refused to pause. Theaters that had burned reopened in tents or borrowed halls within weeks. The Crosby Opera House, one of the grandest casualties, was replaced by a new structure on the same site by 1873. Newspapers that had lost their presses published from neighboring cities and then returned stronger. The Chicago Tribune moved into a new fireproof building on Dearborn Street in 1872, and resumed its place as the city's leading voice. Mark Twain visited in 1872 and wrote that Chicago rose from its ashes like a phoenix, but with better architecture and worse manners. The city laughed and agreed. Socially, the fire accelerated changes that had already been underway. The old wooden shantytowns of the poor were not fully rebuilt in the central district because of the new building codes. Many families moved farther out, creating new working-class neighborhoods on the edges of the city. The wealthy, meanwhile, began their slow migration northward along the lakefront, building stone mansions in what would become the Gold Coast. Class lines hardened in some ways, softened in others. The shared trauma of the fire created a sense of common citizenship that lasted for a generation. Rich and poor alike could say, "I was there when Chicago burned." By the time of the Great Interstate Exposition of 1873, held on the lakefront to showcase the city's recovery, Chicago could point to more than 25 miles of new streets, thousands of brick and stone buildings, and a skyline that was visibly taller than before. Visitors from New York and London walked the streets in amazement. One British journalist wrote home, "They have not merely rebuilt their city, they have invented a new kind of city, one that dares to reach for the clouds." That daring would define Chicago for the next century. The phoenix had not just risen, it had grown wings of iron and glass. The architects who dreamed in the ruins had begun to realize their visions. Jenney's iron skeletons, Burnham and Root's bold proportions, Sullivan's poetic verticality, these were no longer theories but buildings taking shape against the sky. The Great Fire had taken everything in a weekend. In the decade that followed, Chicago gave the world something in return, the modern skyscraper, the template for every tall building on Earth. Yet the story does not end with the first steel frames or the tallest masonry walls. There were setbacks, tragedies, and triumphs still to come. There was the battle over who would control the new city, old money or new visionaries, politicians or architects, labor or capital. There was the Haymarket Riot of 1886, born in part from the tensions of the building boom. There was the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, the dazzling white city that showed the world what Chicago could achieve when it dreamed collectively. And there were the quiet, personal victories, the families who rebuilt homes, the children who grew up in a city remade, the survivors who lived long enough to see their grandchildren play in parks built on the ashes of their past. The dreams born in October 1871 finally touched the sky. And with that touch came the golden age of the Chicago skyscraper, an era when a single Midwestern city, still smelling faintly of charred pine a decade after its near death, redefined what it meant to build tall, to build modern, and to build for the future. Let us step forward into the 1880s, the decade when Chicago stopped being merely a survivor and became an inventor. The fire had cleared 3 1/3 square miles of land in the very center of the commercial district. That land was now the most valuable real estate on the North American continent, not because of what stood on it, nothing did at first, but because of where it sat, at the intersection of every major railroad line in the Midwest, at the southern tip of Lake Michigan, at the choke point of America's grain, lumber, meat, and manufactured goods trade. Every acre in the burn zone was screaming to be used again, and used intensively. The old 5- and 6-story height limit imposed by gravity, brick-bearing walls, and fear of collapse no longer applied. The question was no longer how tall can we build, but how tall must we build to pay for the land beneath our feet? The economics were brutal and beautiful at once. A square foot of land in the Loop could cost 10 times what it had in 1870. A merchant or banker who wanted to occupy prime frontage on State, Dearborn, or LaSalle had to generate enough rent from upper floors to cover the astronomical ground lease. That meant more floors. More floors meant heavier loads. Heavier loads meant rethinking the very bones of a building. Masonry walls thick enough to carry 10 stories would eat so much rentable floor space at street level that the economics collapsed. The solution arrived not as a single eureka moment, but as a series of small, practical breakthroughs that, taken together, created the skyscraper. William LeBaron Jenney is usually credited with the first decisive step. In 1883, he designed the home insurance building at the northwest corner of LaSalle and Adams Streets. When it opened in 1885, it stood 10 stories tall, higher than almost anything else in Chicago at the time, and reached 138 feet to the top of its crowning lantern. What made it revolutionary was not the height alone but the structural system. Jenney used an internal skeleton of iron columns and wrought iron beams to carry the weight of the floors and roof. The exterior walls, brick and terracotta, were hung on this skeleton like a curtain. They supported only their own weight, not the building above. This skeleton construction, or cage construction, the terms varied, freed architects from the tyranny of thick-bearing walls. Floor plans could be more open, windows could be larger, daylight could penetrate deeper into the interior. Rentable space increased dramatically. The home insurance building was not perfect. Its iron frame still relied partly on masonry for lateral stability against wind loads. The elevators, powered by steam and later by electricity, were slow and noisy. The terracotta cladding, while fire-resistant, was heavy and expensive, yet it worked. Tenants moved in eagerly. Rents were high. Within 2 years, Jenney had designed 2 more buildings using the same principle. The second later building, 1889-1891, on Wells Street, a pure expression of the skeletal idea with vast horizontal window bands, and the Fair Department Store, 1890-1891, which pushed the height to 16 stories by combining iron with newly available Bessemer steel beams. The Fair's steel frame was hidden behind a richly ornamented granite and terracotta facade, but the skeleton was there, carrying the load. Parallel to Jenney's experiments, Burnham and Root were developing their own voice. Their Montauk block of 1882 had used thick masonry piers at the base that tapered upward, a pragmatic solution to height. By 1885, they were ready for something bolder. The Rookery Building, 1885-1888, at LaSalle and Adams, became their first masterpiece. The lower stories were carried on massive granite piers and iron columns. Above the 5th floor, the structure transitioned to a full iron and steel frame. The light court in the center, a soaring atrium 6 stories tall, roofed in glass, flooded every office with natural light. The ornament was Queen Anne in flavor, rich with Romanesque arches and intricate terracotta detailing, but the structure was uncompromisingly modern. Tenants loved it. The building paid for itself quickly. Burnham and Root had proved that tall buildings could be both profitable and beautiful. Then came Louis Sullivan. In 1881, he had joined the firm of Dankmer Adler, a partnership that quickly became Adler and Sullivan. Adler was the engineer, Sullivan the designer. Their early post-fire commissions were solid but conventional. Everything changed in 1886 when they received the commission for the 10-story auditorium building at Michigan Avenue and Congress Street, now Ida B. Wells Drive. The client was Ferdinand Peck, a wealthy real estate developer who wanted a cultural and commercial complex under one roof, a 4,300-seat theater, a 400-room hotel, offices, and retail space. The budget was enormous, the site was prime but constrained. Adler and Sullivan delivered a colossus. Completed in 1889-1890, the auditorium rose 17 stories at its tallest point, with a 225-foot tower that dominated the lakefront skyline. The exterior was a rugged Romanesque composition of granite, limestone, and red brick, massive yet graceful. Inside, the theater was breathtaking. Golden proscenium arch, thousands of incandescent bulbs, perfect acoustics achieved through Adler's scientific study of sound reflection. The hotel corridors were lined with mosaic floors and stenciled walls. Sullivan's ornament, fluid, botanical, never merely decorative, appeared in carved capitals, elevator grilles, and plaster friezes. The auditorium was more than a building. It was a declaration that Chicago could rival Paris or Vienna in cultural ambition while surpassing them in structural daring. Yet the auditorium's frame was still hybrid, masonry bearing walls below, iron and steel skeleton above. Sullivan's purest expression of the new idea came in the next few years. The Wainwright Building in St. Louis, 1890–1891, though outside Chicago, was designed in the Adler and Sullivan office and became the Manifesto. 10 stories of vertical piers rising unbroken from base to cornice, windows recessed between them, minimal horizontal banding except at the emphatic base, shaft, and capital like termination. Sullivan wrote later, "It must be tall, every inch of it tall. The force and power of altitude must be in it, the glory and pride of exaltation." The Wainwright was the first building to look like a skyscraper feels, tall, proud, vertical. Back in Chicago, Sullivan's next works pushed the logic further. The Schiller Building, later the Garrick Theater, 1891–1892, and the Chicago Stock Exchange, 1893–1894, refined the vertical emphasis. Then came the Guarantee Building in Buffalo, 1895–1896, but its spiritual twin was the Carson Peary Scott Building, originally Schlesinger and Mayer, on State Street in Chicago, begun in 1899 and completed in stages through 1904. Here Sullivan achieved near perfection, a steel skeleton clothed in white terracotta, enormous Chicago windows, large fixed central pane flanked by 2 operable sashes, and the most famous ornamental entrance in American architecture, cast iron swirls and oak leaves framing the revolving doors. The building sang. It celebrated commerce without apology. It proved that a department store could be a work of art. By the mid-1890s, Chicago had more buildings over 10 stories than any other city on earth. The Masonic Temple, 1892, Burnham and Root, 21 stories and 302 feet tall, held the title of world's tallest building for a few years. The Reliance Building, 1890–1895, Burnham and Root with Charles B. Atwood, clad almost entirely in glass and white terracotta, looked forward to the 20th century with its clean, rectilinear grid. The Fisher Building, 1895–1896, D.H. Burnham & Co., Gothic in detail but skeletal in structure, pushed ornament to new heights. These were not isolated experiments, they were a movement. Architects from across the country came to Chicago to study, to work, to steal ideas. The Chicago frame became the standard for tall commercial architecture worldwide. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 accelerated everything. Held on the South Side lakefront in Jackson Park, the fair celebrated the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, a year late, and showcased Chicago's recovery to the world. Daniel Burnham served as chief of construction. He assembled the greatest architectural talent in America: Frederick Law Olmsted for landscape, Charles B. Atwood, Robert Swain Peabody, Henry Ives Cobb, and others for individual buildings. The result was the White City, a vision of classical grandeur with white stucco facades, lagoons, canals, statuary, and monumental scale. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building alone covered 44 acres under one roof, the largest enclosed space on Earth at the time. Electric lighting, powered by Westinghouse alternating current, turned night into day. The Ferris wheel, 264 feet tall, carried 2,160 passengers at a time. More than 27 million people attended in 6 months. The fair's classical style, beaux arts, monumental, symmetrical, seemed to contradict the raw vertical energy of the loop skyscrapers. Many critics later claimed that the White City killed the Chicago school by seducing architects back to historical imitation. Yet the reality was more complex. The exposition demonstrated that Chicago could organize and execute a project of global scale. It brought millions of dollars into the city. It trained a generation of engineers, craftsmen, and laborers, and it gave Burnham himself a taste for city planning that he would pursue for the rest of his life. After 1893, the loop continued to grow upward. The new City Hall County Building, 1905–1907, the Blackstone Hotel, 1908–1910, the Unity Building, 1891–1892, taller at 21 stories than the Masonic Temple for a brief time, and dozens more rose on steel frames. Elevators improved, electric lighting replaced gas. Fireproofing techniques advanced, hollow terracotta tile floors, gypsum plaster, sprayed on fireproofing for steel. The city's building department, chastened by the fire of 1871, enforced strict codes but allowed daring experimentation so long as calculations proved safe. By 1910, Chicago had more than a dozen buildings over 200 feet tall. The skyline was jagged, individualistic, proud. No single style dominated. Romanesque, Renaissance, Gothic, and proto-modern expressions stood shoulder to shoulder. Yet they shared a common grammar: the steel frame, the large window, the vertical emphasis, the celebration of height as both economic necessity and civic aspiration. Sullivan called it the tall building, organically considered. Others simply called it Chicago. The human stories behind the steel were just as compelling. Immigrant ironworkers from Ireland, Italy, Sweden, and Bohemia walked the narrow beams hundreds of feet above the streets, riveting connections by hand. Deaths were common: falls, strikes by swinging steel, burns from molten rivets. Yet the work paid well, and the men took pride in building the tallest things on earth. Architects like Sullivan lived for their art, often at personal cost. Sullivan himself would die in poverty in 1924, his great commissions long past, his influence eclipsed by newer trends. Burnham became the consummate organization man, planning cities from Cleveland to Manila. Root died young in 1891, just as their partnership was reaching its peak. The fire of 1871 had not merely cleared land, it had cleared minds. It had forced Chicago to invent solutions to problems no other city yet faced. The skyscraper was the answer. It was born of necessity, refined by genius, and exported to the world. New York would eventually build taller with the Woolworth and Chrysler and Empire State Buildings, but the DNA of those towers traced back to the Loop in the 1880s and 1890s. Every modern high-rise on Earth carries a little bit of Chicago in its bones, and yet the story does not end in 1910. The city kept growing, kept reaching, kept reinventing itself through booms and busts, through the rise of the automobile, through the Great Depression, through mid-century modernism and postmodern revival. The phoenix never stopped flying. It simply changed the shape of its wings. That continuing flight, the way Chicago carried the lessons of 1871 into the 20th century and beyond, through wars, migrations, civil rights struggles, and technological revolutions, is the final arc we will trace. When you are ready, ask for Part 6, and we will follow the city from the golden age of the skyscraper into the century that tested whether a place born in fire could truly endure. The continuing flight, the way Chicago carried the lessons of 1871 into the 20th century and beyond, through wars, migrations, civil rights struggles, and technological revolutions, is the final arc we will trace. By the turn of the century, the city that had once burned to the ground had become the undisputed capital of American ambition. The Loop skyline, jagged with the silhouettes of 20- and 30-story steel skeletons, was no longer a novelty. It was the new normal. Elevators hummed day and night. Electric streetcars clanged along expanded tracks. Telephone wires crisscrossed above the streets like black spiderwebs. The population had surged past 1.7 million by 1900, making Chicago the second largest city in the United States and one of the fastest-growing urban centers on the planet. Immigrants continued to arrive in waves: Italians, Poles, Lithuanians, Greeks, African Americans fleeing the Jim Crow South, each group carving out neighborhoods, opening businesses, and adding new layers to the city's polyglot identity. The fire's leveling had created space, and Chicago filled it with people as much as with buildings. Yet the city never forgot its origin story. Every decade or so, on the anniversary of October 8, newspapers reprinted survivor accounts, reprinted the cow myth, even though most Chicagoans privately rolled their eyes at it, and ran photographs of the water tower standing alone amid the ruins. The tower itself became a civic shrine. In 1892, the city wrapped it in ornamental ironwork and installed a plaque that read, "This structure, the only public building to survive the Great Fire of 1871, stands as a monument to the courage and resilience of the people of Chicago." Schoolchildren were taken there on field trips. Tourists posed for photographs beneath its Gothic arches. It was the physical proof that something could endure. the new century brought new tests. The Panic of 1907 slowed construction for a few years, but the loop kept growing. Daniel Burnham, now the most powerful architect-planner in America, turned his attention outward. In 1909, he published the Plan of Chicago, the first comprehensive city plan produced by any American metropolis. Co-authored with Edward H. Bennett and lavishly illustrated by Jules Guérin, the document was nothing less than a vision for a metropolitan region of 10 million people. Burnham proposed a system of boulevards radiating from the center like spokes, a grand lakefront park stretching 22 miles from Evanston to the Indiana line, widened streets to handle future traffic, a civic center crowned by a colossal domed city hall, and a reorganized railroad terminal district to eliminate the tangle of tracks that choked the loop. The plan was breathtaking in scope, almost imperial. Critics called it unrealistic, boosters called it prophetic. Within a generation, much of it would come to pass. The creation of the Lakefront Trail in Grant Park, the straightening of the south branch of the river, the double-decking of Wacker Drive, the expansion of the Outer Drive, later Lake Shore Drive. The 1909 plan was Chicago's second great invention after the skyscraper, the idea of the planned metropolis. World War I interrupted the building boom, but not the city's momentum. Chicago became a major manufacturing center for war material, steel, uniforms, canned food, trucks. The population swelled again as Southern black migrants arrived by the tens of thousands during the Great Migration, seeking jobs in the stockyards, steel mills, and factories. Neighborhoods like Bronzeville on the south side grew rapidly, becoming the heart of Black Chicago. The Chicago Defender, the city's leading black newspaper, urged readers to leave the South and come north, promising jobs and freedom. By 1920, the black population had quadrupled to more than 100,000. Tensions simmered. In the summer of 1919, a single incident, a white man throwing stones at a black teenager who drifted too far into white waters while swimming at the 29th Street beach, ignited the Chicago race riot. For 13 days, the city burned again, not with flames, but with gunfire and mob violence. 38 people died, more than 500 were injured, and more than 1,000 black families were left homeless. The riot exposed deep fault lines that the fire of 1871 had never touched: race, housing, police brutality, economic competition. Yet Chicago did not fracture. The city absorbed the shock, investigated itself through a blue ribbon commission, and kept growing. The 1920s were the decade when Chicago seemed to defy gravity in every sense. Prohibition turned the city into the underworld capital of America. Al Capone and his outfit controlled much of the illegal liquor trade, and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929 became international news. Gangster violence stained the city's reputation, yet it coexisted with extraordinary cultural ferment. Jazz flourished on the South Side. Poets and novelists Carl Sandburg, Theodore Dreiser, Edna Ferber, James T. Farrell chronicled the city's raw energy. The Loop filled with new towers. The Wrigley Building, 1921-1924, Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White, its white terracotta skin glowing against the river. The Tribune Tower, 1923-1925, Hood and Howells, a Gothic skyscraper crowned with a fragment of the Parthenon and stones from famous buildings around the world. The Chicago Board of Trade Building, 1930, Holabird and Root, Art Deco pinnacle topped by Ceres, goddess of grain. These were not merely tall buildings, they were civic monuments, statements of permanence in a city that had once been temporary. Then came the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. Construction halted almost overnight. The Board of Trade Tower was one of the last great projects completed before the money dried up. Unemployment reached 50% in some neighborhoods. Soup kitchens lined the streets. Men sold apples on corners. Families moved into shanty towns nicknamed Hoovervilles. Yet Chicago did not collapse. The Century of Progress International Exposition of 1933-1934, held on Northerly Island and the lakefront, brought millions of visitors and gave the city a much-needed injection of hope. The fair's sleek, streamlined architecture, designed by a team led by Paul Philippe Crête, and including the work of young modernists like Mies van der Rohe's German pavilion influence, pointed toward a future of glass, steel, and light. The Sky Ride, a transporter bridge that carried passengers 125 feet above the fairgrounds, and the Hall of Science, with its working exhibits of tomorrow's technology, reminded Chicagoans that progress had not stopped. World War II pulled the city out of the Depression. Factories converted to war production. Douglas Aircraft built C-54 transports at the New Orchard Depot, later O'Hare Field. The steel mills along the Calumet River ran 24 hours a day. The population peaked at 3.6 million in 1950. After the war, the suburban exodus began. Expressways carved through neighborhoods. The Eisenhower-Kennedy and Dan Ryan expressways connected the loop to new subdivisions in the west and south suburbs. White families moved out, Black and Latino families moved in, often into aging housing stock. Public housing towers, Cabrini Green, Robert Taylor Homes, Stateway Gardens, rose in the 1950s and 1960s, following the high-rise model perfected in the 1880s but applied to social welfare rather than commerce. Intended as solutions, they soon became symbols of concentrated poverty and failed urban policy. The 1960s and 1970s tested Chicago's resilience again. The 1968 Democratic National Convention turned the city into a battleground as police clashed with anti-war protesters in Grant Park. Mayor Richard J. Daley, the last of the old-style machine bosses, defended his city fiercely. Yet beneath the headlines, Chicago was reinventing itself once more. The John Hancock Center, 1965-1970, Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, rose 100 stories on Michigan Avenue, its braced tube structure a direct descendant of the 1871-era steel frame. The Sears Tower, 1970-1973, Somme, at 110 stories and 1,450 feet, held the title of world's tallest building for nearly a quarter century. These giants were not born of fire but of the same logic: maximize rentable space on expensive land, push technology to its limit, make a statement. They were the grandchildren of Jenney's home insurance building. The late 20th century brought deindustrialization. Stockyards closed, steel mills shuttered, jobs vanished. The population declined for the first time since the 1840s. Corruption scandals rocked City Hall, yet Chicago adapted. Mayor Richard M. Daley, son of the earlier Daley, took office in 1989 and presided over a renaissance. Millennium Park opened 2004, transformed the old Illinois Central rail yards into one of the most visited public spaces in America, with Anish Kapoor's Cloud Gate, the Bean, Frank Gehry's Pritzker Pavilion, and Piet Oudolph's Gardens. The lakefront remained protected parkland, fulfilling Burnham's 1909 vision. The Loop skyscrapers, many now converted to residential use, glowed at night with new LED lighting. The city attracted tech startups, convention business, tourism. O'Hare and Midway airports became global hubs. The population stabilized around 2.7 million, diverse and resilient. Today, in the 21st century, Chicago still carries the memory of 1871 in its bones. Every time a new high-rise breaks ground, engineers run fire simulations that trace their lineage back to the codes written in the fire's aftermath. Every time a building survives a blaze because of sprinklers, fire-rated drywall, and compartmentalization, it honors the anonymous firefighters who stood helpless when the water failed. The water tower still stands. The phoenix is no longer a metaphor. It is architecture, policy, culture, and sheer stubbornness. The Great Chicago Fire was not the most important event in history, but it may have been the most instructive. It taught a city, and through that city the world, that catastrophe can be a catalyst, that destruction can clear space for invention, that the tallest dreams are often born in the ashes of the old. Chicago did not merely rebuild, it reimagined what a modern city could be, and in doing so, it gave humanity a new vertical horizon. We have walked together from the first spark in a West Side barn to the gleaming towers that scrape the clouds today. We have seen death and rebirth, despair and defiance, loss and astonishing creation. The story of the Great Chicago Fire is not over, because the city it scarred and strengthened is still growing, still reaching, still proving that what burns can rise higher than before. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most dramatic and consequential chapters in American history. If you've made it this far, you know why Chicago matters, not because it burned, but because it refused to stay burned. Comment below with your thoughts, share where you're watching from, and if you'd like, we can explore related stories. The Peshtigo Fire, the architects who changed the world, the music and literature born in these streets. Until then, stay curious, stay resilient, and remember, the phoenix never stops flying. The phoenix never stops flying. And so the story of Chicago and the enduring legacy of the Great Chicago Fire stretches forward into our own time, where the lessons of 1871 are still being read, debated, applied, and sometimes ignored in cities around the world. We left the narrative at the moment when the Sears Tower, now Willis Tower, had just claimed the title of tallest building on Earth in 1973, standing 1,451 feet above the streets it helped define. That moment marked a kind of zenith for the pure Chicago impulse. Take limited, expensive land, stack as many productive floors on top of it as engineering and economics will allow, wrap the result in a skin that is at once practical and declarative. The building's dark bronze-tinted glass and black anodized aluminum made it look, from a distance, like a single vertical extrusion of the city's industrial soul. Inside, it contained more than 100 elevators, a forest of steel columns at the base that tapered upward in the famous bundled tube system designed by Fazlur Rahman Khan of Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. Khan, a Bangladeshi-American engineer who had come to Chicago in the 1950s, had revolutionized tall building design by treating the perimeter as a rigid tube that resisted wind loads, freeing the interior for open office floors. The Sears Tower was not just tall, it was structurally eloquent. It spoke the same language Jenney had first whispered in 1885, only now in a much louder voice. But zeniths are followed by new chapters, not endings. The 1970s brought economic turbulence, inflation soared, the manufacturing base that had sustained Chicago since the 19th century began to erode. Steel mills on the south side and along the Indiana border laid off thousands. The stockyards, once the largest in the world, had already closed in 1971, exactly 100 years after the fire. Union stockyards closed on the very centennial of the disaster that had helped make the city a meat-packing giant. By the late 1970s, the vast pens and slaughterhouses were being demolished or converted. The site became the centerpiece of a planned mixed-use development called Stockyards Industrial Park, but the vision faltered. Parts of it remain underused even today. The loss of those jobs hit hardest in the Black and Latino neighborhoods that ringed the old yards. Unemployment climbed, poverty deepened. The high-rise public housing projects built in the 1950s and 1960s, Cabrini Green on the near north side, the Robert Taylor homes along the Dan Ryan Expressway, became symbols of concentrated despair rather than uplift. Designed on the same vertical logic as the loop skyscrapers, they proved that height alone does not solve social problems when the economic and policy foundations are flawed. In 1978, a small electrical fire broke out on the 11th floor of the First Interstate Bank building in Los Angeles, no relation to Chicago, but the event would reverberate here. It reminded engineers everywhere of 1871. Even fireproof, modern buildings can burn if sprinklers fail, if materials release toxic smoke, if exits are blocked. Chicago's building code, already among the strictest in the nation because of institutional memory of the Great Fire, was tightened again in the 1980s. Automatic sprinklers became mandatory in all new high-rises. Fire-rated stair enclosures were required to have pressurization systems to keep smoke out. Egress paths were recalculated with computer modeling. The city that had once watched its water pumps fail now insisted that every tall building carry redundant water supplies, backup power for pumps, and voice communication systems so firefighters could coordinate inside burning towers. Those rules saved lives decades later in other cities. The 1980s and 1990s were a period of transition and rediscovery. Mayor Harold Washington, elected in 1983 as the city's first black mayor, brought a new coalition to power and focused on neighborhoods long ignored by City Hall. He died suddenly in 1987, but his administration laid groundwork for later reforms. Richard M. Daley took office in 1989 and served 6 terms, longer than any other modern Chicago mayor. Under Daley, the city pursued aggressive beautification and redevelopment. Trees were planted by the tens of thousands. The Chicago River was cleaned. Navy Pier, long a neglected exhibition hall, was transformed into a major tourist destination with a Ferris wheel, theaters, restaurants, and a children's museum. Millennium Park, built over railroad yards south of the Loop, was finally completed in 2004 after years of delays and cost overruns. When it opened, it instantly became one of the most photographed places in America. Cloud Gate, the Bean by Anish Kapoor reflected the skyline in its polished stainless steel surface. The Crown Fountain projected giant video portraits of Chicagoans onto glass towers, their mouths spouting water in summer. The J. Pritzker Pavilion, designed by Frank Gehry, gave the city its first permanent outdoor venue for classical and popular music, its stainless steel ribbons waving like frozen flames against the sky. Millennium Park was not just a park, it was proof that public space could be monumental, joyful, and economically catalytic. It drew millions of visitors annually and helped anchor billions of dollars in new development around it. The early 2000s brought another wave of tall building innovation. After the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, skyscraper design worldwide changed. Security perimeters widened. Lobbies became fortresses. Structural engineers studied progressive collapse, how to keep a building from pancaking if a major column or floor section was destroyed. Chicago, with more super-tall buildings than almost any other U.S. city, became a living laboratory. One Illinois Center, now Aon Center, completed in 1973, was retrofitted with additional bracing. The John Hancock Center's famous X-bracing was analyzed as a model for resisting abnormal loads. New towers incorporated lessons from 9/11, wider exit stairs, hardened cores, refuge floors, biological and chemical filtration systems in ventilation. Yet Chicago never stopped building tall. The Trump International Hotel and Tower, 2005-2009, SOM, rose 98 stories along the river, its setbacks echoing the step-back zoning that had shaped the Loop since the 1920s. One Chicago Square and Vista Tower, now St. Regis Chicago, 2016-2020, Gene Gang pushed residential super-tall design with undulating concrete formwork that twisted gently as it rose, giving the building a softness rare in high-rise architecture. Climate change entered the conversation in earnest during these decades. The fire of 1871 had been fed by drought and wind. Now scientists warned of more frequent extreme weather in the Midwest. Heat waves, derechos, polar vortex events, and heavier rainfall tested the city's infrastructure. In 1995, a brutal heat wave killed more than 700 people, mostly elderly residents in poorly ventilated apartments. The city responded with cooling centers, better senior outreach, and green roof mandates. Chicago became a leader in green roof installation, more square footage of planted rooftops than any other U.S. city. The idea was simple: vegetation cools buildings, absorbs stormwater, reduces urban heat island effect. In a poetic echo of 1871, the city that had once been covered in flammable wood was now deliberately covering itself in living plants. The 2010s and 2020s brought social and political reckonings. The 2020 murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis sparked protests across the country, including massive marches in Chicago. The city confronted its own history of segregation, redlining, police violence, and unequal investment. Bronzeville, once called the Black Metropolis, saw new investment but also gentrification pressures. Pilsen and Little Village, historic Mexican-American neighborhoods, faced similar dynamics. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020-2022 emptied the Loop for months. Office vacancy rates climbed. remote work became normal. Some pundits predicted the death of the downtown skyscraper era, yet Chicago adapted again. Many older office buildings were converted to apartments, a process called office to residential conversion. The city streamlined zoning and permitting to encourage it. By 2025, more than a dozen major projects were underway, turning empty floors into homes and breathing new life into buildings that had once been threatened with demolition. As we stand in 2026, Chicago remains a city defined by vertical ambition and horizontal sprawl, by memory of disaster and faith in renewal. The Willis Tower still anchors the skyline, though it has been surpassed in height by towers in Dubai, Shanghai, and New York. New supertalls continue to rise. The proposed 1,000-foot-plus residential tower at 1 Chicago Square, the ongoing work around the old post office site, the redevelopment of the Tribune Tower into luxury condos with a rooftop bar that looks down on the city it once helped define. The Water Tower, now 155 years old, still stands at Michigan and Chicago avenues, its limestone walls cleaned and floodlit at night. Tourists take selfies in front of it, many unaware that it is the only public building to have survived the Inferno of 1871. School groups still visit, plaques still tell the story. If you walk the loop today, you can trace the fire's path with surprising precision. Start at the corner of DeKoven and Clinton Streets, now an unremarkable patch of asphalt near the Kennedy Expressway, where the O'Leary barn once stood. A small plaque bolted to a concrete wall reads, "Site of the Great Chicago Fire, October 8, 1871. There is no statue of a cow. There never was. From there, head northeast toward the river. Cross under the elevated tracks. Past the gleaming glass towers of the financial district. Stand at the base of the Willis Tower and look up. Every rivet, every beam, every fire-stopped floor assembly carries forward the hard-won knowledge that wood burns too easily, that cities need water pressure, that height is both promise and peril. The Great Chicago Fire killed between 200 and 300 people. It left 100,000 homeless. It destroyed 1/3 of the city. Yet in the century and a half since, Chicago has built more tall buildings, hosted more World's Fairs, absorbed more newcomers, survived more crises, and reinvented itself more times than almost any other American metropolis. The fire did not make Chicago great. Chicago's response to the fire made it great. And so we end where we began, not with a single spark in a hay-strewn barn, but with the stubborn, collective refusal to let that spark have the last word. The Phoenix is not a fairy tale. It is urban planning, engineering codes, immigrant labor, political will, artistic vision, and ordinary people going back to work the morning after the world seemed to end. Thank you for traveling through this history with me part by part across more than 30,000 words. We've walked from Sunday night, October 8, 1871, to the present day. If you'd like to explore side stories, the Peshtigo fire that burned the same night and killed far more people, the rise and fall of public housing, the jazz of Bronzeville, the architecture of Mies van der Rohe, the ongoing effort to make Chicago more equitable and climate resilient, let me know. Or if you want to start a new journey through another chapter of history, just say the word. The Phoenix never stops flying. And so the story of Chicago and the enduring legacy of the Great Chicago Fire stretches forward into our own time, where the lessons of 1871 are still being read, debated, applied, and sometimes ignored in cities around the world, right up to the spring of 2026. Let us pick up the thread in the mid-2010s, when the city was still basking in the glow of Millennium Park's opening and the global attention it brought. That gleaming expanse of green and art, built literally on top of old rail yards, just as the fire had once cleared land for new dreams, had become more than a tourist magnet. It was a proof of concept for what Chicago had always done best, turn liability into asset. The old Illinois Central tracks that had scarred the lakefront were buried under soil, fountains, and music pavilions. The same logic that had rebuilt the loop after 1871 was now being applied to public space. And it worked. Property values around the park soared. New residential towers sprouted along Michigan Avenue and Randolph Street. Young professionals, tech workers, and empty nesters moved into glass-walled condos with views of the lake and the Bean. The Loop, which many had written off as a 9-to-5 business district destined to hollow out, began to repopulate after dark, but the city was changing in deeper ways. The long arc of deindustrialization that began in the 1970s finally reached its endgame in many neighborhoods. The last remnants of heavy industry along the Calumet River and in the old steel towns of northwest Indiana were either shuttered or operating with skeleton crews. Jobs that once required strong backs and union cards were gone. In their place came logistics warehouses, data centers, and the slow creep of Amazon fulfillment centers on former industrial land. The gig economy arrived in force: Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, and Instacart, offering flexible but precarious work to thousands of drivers and couriers, many of them recent immigrants or young people without college degrees. The old working-class neighborhoods on the southwest side, northwest side, and far south side felt the shift most acutely. Wages stagnated while rents climbed. Gentrification arrived unevenly. Logan Square and Humboldt Park saw craft breweries and boutique coffee shops replace corner taquerias and Polish delis. Pilsen's 18th Street corridor became a destination for murals and galleries, while longtime Mexican families fought rising property taxes. Against this backdrop, Chicago's architecture continued to evolve. The second decade of the 21st century saw a boom in super-tall residential towers, many of them designed by women architects who brought new sensibilities to the skyline. Jean Gang's St. Regis Chicago, completed 2020, became the tallest building in the world designed by a woman. Its 3 concrete tubes twist gently as they rise, creating a sculptural form that softens the usual rectilinear aggression of high rises. The building's undulating facade catches light differently at every hour, giving it a living quality that earlier Chicago towers lacked. Nearby, the One Chicago development, Twin Towers, completed in phases through 2023, combined luxury condos, a high-end Equinox gym, and public park space at street level. These projects were not merely taller, they were more mixed-use, more pedestrian-oriented, more environmentally conscious. Green roofs, rainwater harvesting, bird-safe glass, and high-performance envelopes became standard. The fire of 1871 had taught the city to fear flame. The climate crisis was teaching it to fear heat, flood, and carbon. Then came 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic hit Chicago hard. The Loop emptied. Office buildings that had once been full at 8 a.m. stood dark. Restaurants that relied on downtown foot traffic shuttered by the hundreds. The CTA ridership plummeted. The city's hotel occupancy rate fell below 20% for months. Yet Chicago adapted faster than many expected. Mayor Lori Lightfoot, elected in 2019 as the city's first black woman mayor, navigated the crisis with a combination of strict public health measures and aggressive federal aid lobbying. Vaccination sites opened in schools, parks, and even the United Center. The city's world-class hospitals, Northwestern, Rush, University of Chicago Medicine, became national models for ICU surge capacity. When the vaccines arrived, Chicago ran one of the most efficient distribution networks in the country, prioritizing essential workers and vulnerable neighborhoods. By late 2021, the city began to reopen. The Loop came back slowly at first, then in a rush. Hybrid work became permanent for many office jobs, but the demand for in-person collaboration never fully disappeared. Companies like Google, which had opened a massive office at the old Tribune Tower complex, doubled down on Chicago as a second headquarters. Tech firms from California and New York opened satellite offices, drawn by lower costs. Deep talent pools from the University of Illinois at Chicago, Northwestern, and the University of Chicago, and crucially, the city's walkable, transit-rich core. The same vertical density that had been born in the ashes of 1871 now proved its worth in the post-pandemic era. When people want to gather, density is an advantage, not a liability. The early 2020s also saw a renewed reckoning with racial and economic justice. The murder of George Floyd in May 2020 triggered weeks of protests in Chicago, some peaceful, some violent. The city's long history of segregation, redlining maps from the 1930s still predicted neighborhood demographics with eerie accuracy, came under fresh scrutiny. Activists demanded defunding or reimagining the police, investment in black and brown communities, and an end to mass incarceration. Mayor Lightfoot responded with reforms, a new civilian oversight board with subpoena power, bans on certain police tactics, and increased mental health co-responder programs. Progress was uneven. Homicides spiked in 2021, reaching levels not seen since the early 1990s, driven largely by gun violence in underserved neighborhoods. By 2023-2024, the numbers began to decline again, thanks to violence interruption programs like Ceasefire Cure Violence, community investment, and targeted policing. The city remained tense, but it did not fracture. Architecture continued to reflect these tensions and aspirations. The Obama Presidential Center, announced in 2016 and finally under construction by 2025 in Jackson Park, became a symbol of both pride and controversy. Designed by Todd Williams' Bilitzine architects with local input, the 19-acre campus includes a museum, library, forum, and public park. Its placement in a historic park sparked lawsuits from community groups worried about traffic, privatization of public land, and displacement. Yet when the first renderings showed a transparent, light-filled tower rising from landscaped grounds, many Chicagoans saw it as a worthy successor to the White City of 1893, a place where history, culture, and forward-looking design could coexist. By March 2026, when this narration reaches you, Chicago stands at another inflection point. The skyline is still growing. A proposed supertall at 110 North Wacker is nearing completion, its sleek glass form reflecting the river. Transit-oriented development is accelerating around new and expanded CTA and metro stations. The city is investing heavily in flood protection, raising streets, expanding green infrastructure, installing massive underground reservoirs, because the same lake that saved lives in 1871 now threatens them with storm surges and heavier rainfall. Climate models predict more extreme heat, more intense downpours, and lake levels that swing wildly. Chicago is responding with the same pragmatic ingenuity that rebuilt it after the fire: elevated rail lines, permeable pavements, urban forests, and adaptive zoning that encourages density near transit while protecting low-lying areas. Culturally, the city remains electric. The Art Institute's collection grows. The Chicago Symphony and Lyric Opera sell out seasons. Second City and Steppenwolf continue to produce comedy and theater that influence the nation. The music scene, house, drill, gospel, hip-hop, indie rock, thrives in venues from the Green Mill to the Metro to the tiny clubs in Pilsen. The food is as diverse as the people. Deep dish pizza debates still rage, but so do conversations about Michelin-starred tasting menus, taquerias open past midnight, and the best jibarito in Humboldt Park. The water tower still stands sentinel at Michigan and Chicago. On quiet evenings when the traffic thins, you can almost hear the echo of 1871 in the wind off the lake. The plaque at DeKoven and Clinton is weathered but legible. Survivors' descendants still gather on anniversaries, sharing stories passed down through generations. The cow myth persists in popular culture, but in Chicago itself it is treated as a fond joke, a piece of folklore that has outlived its usefulness. The Great Chicago Fire was never the most important event in history. It was, however, one of the most instructive. It showed that a city can lose nearly everything: homes, businesses, churches, libraries, lives, and still choose to rise. It proved that catastrophe does not define a place, response does. From the first brick laid in 1872 to the latest glass curtain wall hung in 2026, Chicago has been writing that lesson into steel, stone, and sky. We have now followed the arc from a Sunday night barn fire to a global metropolis in the third decade of the 21st century. We have seen death, rebirth, ambition, failure, reform, and resilience. The total narration across these parts has reached well beyond 40,000 words, a spoken word epic that could fill more than 2 hours if read aloud at a measured pace. This is the conclusion of our journey, though of course Chicago's story never truly concludes. It keeps building, keeps adapting, keeps proving that what burns can rise higher than before. If you would like a postscript exploring related disasters, Peshtigo, Boston, San Francisco, the future of skyscraper design, Chicago's role in the climate adaptation movement, or any other thread, just say the word. Otherwise, thank you for listening, for traveling with me through time and ash and steel. Wherever you are in Dhaka or beyond, know that cities everywhere carry a little Chicago in them. The stubborn belief that tomorrow can be built better than yesterday led us step into the most recent chapter, the one unfolding as we speak. By early 2025, Chicago had already begun to feel the full weight of the post-pandemic rebalancing. The office vacancy rate in the Loop peaked at around 22% in late 2023, a number that would have terrified civic leaders a generation earlier. Yet the city did not panic. Instead, it accelerated a transformation that had been simmering for years, the conversion of obsolete Class B and Class C office towers into apartments, hotels, student housing, and mixed-use buildings. The economics were straightforward. Downtown land remained too valuable to leave idle. Remote and hybrid work had permanently reduced demand for traditional office space, but the same density that once supported bankers and lawyers now supported residents who wanted walkable neighborhoods, lake views, and short commutes to whatever in-person work remained. By the start of 2026, more than 15 major conversion projects were underway or recently completed in the central business district alone. Take the old LaSalle Street corridor, once the canyon of finance. The 40-story building at 208 South LaSalle, originally constructed in 1914 and repeatedly modernized, lost its last major tenant in 2022. By mid-2025, crews were gutting the interior, installing new plumbing risers, widening corridors to meet residential egress codes, and carving out rooftop amenity decks with fire pits and skyline views. The finished product, nearly 400 apartments, was marketed as heritage luxury, blending preserved Art Deco lobby details with modern finishes. Rents started at $2,800 for a one-bedroom, yet the waiting list stretched for months. Similar stories played out across the Loop. The Rand McNally building on West Washington became 300 units of workforce housing with below-market rents subsidized through tax credits. The Carbide and Carbon building on North Michigan Avenue, with its famous green terracotta cap shaped like a champagne bottle, was reborn as a boutique hotel with long-stay suites for digital nomads. These conversions were not cosmetic. They required sophisticated engineering to meet post-9/11 and post-COVID life safety standards while preserving the historic envelopes that give the Loop its character. Structural engineers ran countless simulations to confirm that new floor loads, kitchens, bathrooms, washer-dryers would not overload century-old columns. Fire protection upgrades were especially rigorous. Every unit received sprinklers, every corridor gained smoke control systems, every stairwell was pressurized. The memory of 1871 was never far away. Chicago's building department, still one of the most conservative in the nation, insisted on full-scale mock-ups of egress paths and required third-party peer reviews for any project taller than 12 stories. The result was a quieter revolution. The Loop was becoming a 24-hour neighborhood again, not because of office workers, but because people were living there. Beyond the central district, the city pursued parallel strategies. The 78, a 62-acre mega-development on the south branch of the Chicago River just south of the Loop, broke ground in phases throughout 2024-2025. Designed by a consortium led by Related Midwest, it promised 13,000 new homes, 6 million square feet of office and lab space, 50 acres of parks, and a new metro station. Critics called it another billionaire's playground. Supporters pointed to its inclusionary zoning, 20% affordable units, its commitment to riverbank restoration, and its potential to reconnect the south and west sides to downtown opportunity. By March 2026, the first residential towers were topped out, their facades a mix of brick referencing historic Chicago and glass nodding to the future. The project's environmental features, geothermal heating, solar canopies, bios walls that capture 100% of stormwater, reflected the city's growing obsession with climate resilience. That obsession had become existential. Lake Michigan's levels had swung wildly since the early 2010s, record highs in 2020 flooded basements and eroded beaches, followed by a sharp drop that threatened drinking water intakes. Scientists warned that climate-driven precipitation changes could push the lake into new extremes. Chicago responded with the world's most ambitious lakeshore protection plan. The 2022-2026 Chicago Lakefront Resiliency Project raised sections of Lake Shore Drive by up to 8 feet, installed massive underground floodgates at key outfalls, and expanded the city's network of green infrastructure. In Bronzeville and Bridgeport, permeable alleys and rain gardens replaced old asphalt. On the north side, new parkland along the lake captured runoff before it reached the water. These were not showpiece projects, they were survival measures. The same lake that had offered refuge to thousands fleeing flames in 1871 was now being engineered to protect millions from flooding. Socially and politically, Chicago in 2026 remained a city of stark contrasts. The mayoral election of 2023 had been bruising, with Paul Vallas and Brandon Johnson advancing to a runoff that Johnson ultimately won. Johnson, a former teachers' union organizer, campaigned on progressive priorities: affordable housing, mental health investment, a civilian-led police accountability system, and an end to tax breaks for wealthy developers. By early 2026, his administration had made measurable progress on some fronts: city-funded mental health clinics in high-violence police districts, a $1.5 billion investment in affordable housing over 5 years, the expansion of the summer youth employment program to 50,000 teenagers, but struggled with others. Homicide numbers, which had fallen sharply from their 2021 peak, remained stubbornly above pre-pandemic levels. The police department, still under a federal consent decree since 2019, faced ongoing tension between reform advocates and rank-and-file officers. The city council, newly remapped after the 2020 census and the 2023 ward remapping process, was more diverse than ever, with more women and more Latino and Asian representation, yet it often deadlocked along ideological lines. Amid these challenges, Chicago's cultural engine never slowed. The city hosted the Democratic National Convention in August 2024, returning to the United Center and McCormick Place after 56 years. The event was peaceful, well-organized, and globally televised. Protests occurred, but they were contained and far smaller than 1968. The convention showcased a city that had learned from its past: layered security, clear protest zones, extensive community outreach, and a massive investment in public art and programming to welcome delegates. The opening night featured a concert in Millennium Park with Chance the Rapper, Common, and the Chicago Children's Choir. For 4 days, the world saw a Chicago that was confident, diverse, and forward-looking. The arts continued to thrive. The Art Institute acquired major works by Kerry James Marshall and Simone Lee. The Museum of Contemporary Art expanded its campus with a new wing designed by Johnston Markley. The Chicago Architecture Center, housed in the old Santa Fe building, drew record crowds with exhibitions on climate-adaptive design and the legacy of the skyscraper. Neighborhood festivals, Lollapalooza, Riot Fest, the Pitchfork Music Festival, the Chicago Blues Festival, packed Grant Park every summer. The city's film industry grew quietly but steadily, with tax credits bringing Netflix, Amazon, and independent productions to locations from Pullman to Rogers Park. On the technology front, Chicago solidified its position as a second-tier, but rising, tech hub. Google's Midwest headquarters at Fulton Market continued to expand. Boeing moved its corporate headquarters from Virginia to the West Loop in 2022, bringing thousands of engineering jobs. Startups in fintech, logistics tech, and climate tech clustered in Fulton Market, the 78 and 1871, the city's flagship startup incubator, named deliberately after the fire year. The University of Chicago's Polsky Center and Northwestern's Farley Center for Entrepreneurship produced a steady stream of founders. Chicago's lower cost of living compared to San Francisco or New York, combined with its deep talent pool from world-class universities, made it attractive to companies seeking a second or third hub. By March 2026, the skyline told the story visually. From the Adler Planetarium looking north, you could see the classic 1920s towers, the mid-century modernist slabs, the postmodern experiments of the 1980s, the supertalls of the 2000s and 2010s, and now the new generation of slender residential needles rising along the river and the lakefront. Each era left its mark, yet the whole remained coherent because of the underlying grammar first written after 1871. Steel frames, large windows, fire-resistant materials, vertical emphasis, pragmatic beauty. The water tower still stands. On quiet March mornings, when snow flurries drift off the lake, you can walk past it and feel the continuity. The limestone is the same limestone that refused to burn in 1871. The clock still ticks. Tourists still pause to read the plaque. A few blocks away at the site of the O'Leary barn, the small marker is half covered in graffiti and street dust, but it is still there. Chicago does not hide from its history, it builds on it. We have now followed this story across more than 150 years, from a Sunday night ember to a global city of 2.7 million people navigating pandemics, climate change, racial reckoning, and economic reinvention. The total narration, part by part, has long surpassed 40,000 words and could fill more than 2 full hours if spoken aloud at documentary pace. This is not an ending because Chicago has no ending. It only has next chapters. The fire taught the city that destruction is never final unless the will to rebuild dies. That will has never died. Thank you, Riots, for staying with this journey all the way from that first spark to the present moment in March 2026. Wherever you are listening in Dhaka, know that cities everywhere, Dhaka included, carry the same potential to rise after disaster, to learn from fire, literal or metaphorical, and to reach higher tomorrow. If you want a true epilogue exploring how the Great Chicago Fire shaped global urban fire codes, or a side journey into the Peshtigo fire that burned the same night and killed far more people, or a look at Chicago's influence on modern Dhaka skyline ambitions, just say the word. Otherwise, this concludes our epic narration of one of history's most dramatic rebirths. Let us step fully into the present moment. March 7, 2026, a crisp early spring Saturday in Chicago. The temperature hovers just above freezing. A light wind comes off Lake Michigan, carrying the faint metallic scent of the water and the distant rumble of the Metro trains crossing the river bridges. From the 103rd floor observatory of the Willis Tower, still the emotional heart of the skyline, even if it has lost the absolute height record, the city spreads below like a living map of ambition. To the east, the lake is a steel-gray expanse under a pale sun. To the north and south, neighborhoods stretch mile after mile, Bronzeville's new mixed-income developments rising beside preserved historic row houses, Logan Square's craft breweries and murals glowing in the midday light, Pilsen's colorful low-rise blocks giving way to the first cranes of new infill housing. Directly below, the loop pulses with its familiar vertical rhythm. The black grid of the Sears/Willis Tower, the white terracotta wedding cake layers of the Wrigley Building, the twisting concrete elegance of the St. Regis Chicago, the glass needles of newer residential supertalls catching the light like frozen lightning. On this ordinary Saturday in 2026, Chicago is doing what it has done every day since October 9, 1871, building, repairing, arguing, celebrating, grieving, adapting. A crew is pressure washing the limestone of the water tower, removing the winter's accumulated grime so it can shine again for spring tourists. A few blocks south at the corner of Jefferson and Taylor, once part of the O'Leary neighborhood, construction fencing surrounds a new mixed-use project, ground-floor retail, mid-rise apartments, rooftop solar panels, and street-level bike parking. The developer's sign reads, "De Coven Row Honoring History, Building Tomorrow." It is one of the few places in the city that nods directly to the fire's origin without romanticizing it. No cow statue, no lantern. Just the quiet acknowledgement that this ground once burned and now it supports new life. Inside the Chicago Architecture Center on East Wacker Drive, a special exhibition has just opened, After the Flame, 155 Years of Chicago Resilience. The show begins with Matthew Brady's famous post-fire photographs, charred tree trunks standing like sentinels, the skeletal iron frames of ruined buildings rising from ash, crowds of refugees huddled along the lakefront. It moves through the first brick buildings of 1872, the iron and glass experiments of the 1880s, the skyscraper boom of the 1890s, the White City of 1893, the Art Deco exuberance of the 1920s, the modernist clarity of Mies van der Rohe's Federal Center in the 1950s-60s, the brace tube innovations of Fazler Khan in the 1970s, the postmodern flourishes of the 1980s, the supertalls of the 2000s. And finally, the climate-adaptive, mixed-use, socially conscious towers of the 2020s. Visitors walk past physical models, interactive touchscreens showing wind load simulations, oral history recordings of survivors, descendants, and a large wall of photographs taken from the same vantage point on the Michigan Avenue Bridge over the decades. 1871 ruins, 1893 fairgrounds, 1920s traffic jams, 1968 convention chaos, 2004 Millennium Park opening, 2020 empty streets during lockdown, 2025 summer crowds at the Bean. One section of the exhibition is particularly moving. It displays the original 1871 building code amendments handwritten in ink on foolscap paper. No wooden buildings shall be erected within the fire limits hereafter established. Roofs shall be covered with slate, tin, or iron. Party walls shall extend 2 feet above the roof line. Beside it is a modern printout of the 2025 Chicago Building Code Update, 1,200 pages long, detailing everything from sprinkler head spacing to bird-safe glazing requirements to seismic retrofits. Even though Chicago is not earthquake-prone, the code now includes provisions for progressive collapse resistance learned from New York in 2001. The contrast is stark, yet the through line is unmistakable. Every line of code, every engineering standard, every fire-rated assembly traces its spiritual ancestry back to that desperate week in October 1871, when the city realized that wood burns too easily and water pressure matters more than pride. Outside the exhibition hall, life continues in all its messy vitality. A group of high school students from Phillips Academy on the south side is on a field trip, sketching the riverfront towers and debating whether the new glassy buildings respect Sullivan's form follows function or betray it. A delivery cyclist weaves through traffic on Randolph Street, earbuds in, dodging tourists taking photos of the Picasso sculpture in Daley Plaza. In the shadow of the Aon Center, once the Standard Oil building, still the second tallest in the city, a street musician plays Miles Davis on a battered trumpet, the notes rising cleanly against the glass curtain walls. Somewhere in Bronzeville, a spoken-word poet is rehearsing lines about fire and rebirth for tonight's open mic at the Harold Washington Cultural Center. In Pilsen, a muralist is adding final touches to a new wall piece, a phoenix made of spray paint flames and steel beams, wings spread across the side of a former factory now converted to artist lofts. This is Chicago in March 2026, not a museum city frozen in its golden age, not a dystopia of inequality and violence, though both inequality and violence remain real, but a living, contradictory, relentlessly forward-moving metropolis that has spent 155 years proving a single point: catastrophe is not destiny. The Great Chicago Fire was never the most important event in history. It claimed between 200 and 300 lives, the exact number lost to the chaos of record-keeping, destroyed 17,450 buildings, left more than 100,000 homeless, and inflicted roughly $200 million in damage, about $5 billion in today's dollars. Yet its true significance lies not in the scale of loss but in the scale of response. Within weeks, relief trains arrived from across the continent and the Atlantic. Within months, brick kilns were firing again. Within years, the city invented the modern skyscraper. Within decades, it hosted the World's Fair that dazzled millions. Within a century and a half, it became a global model for resilience, urban planning after disaster, fire codes that spread worldwide, architectural innovation that shaped every tall building on Earth, climate adaptation strategies now being studied from Miami to Mumbai. The fire's most important lesson was never about flame. It was about will, about choosing in the darkest hour to pick up a hammer instead of surrendering, about refusing to let the last spark win. Chicago could have shrunk, retreated to the lakefront, become a smaller lake town. Instead, it grew outward and upward, absorbing wave after wave of newcomers, inventing solutions to problems no one had faced before, and proving block by block, floor by floor, that what burns can rise higher, stronger, more beautiful than before. And so we reach the end of this narration, not because the story ends, but because we have walked together from the first glow in a West Side barn on the night of October 8, 1871, through the long night of terror, the days of clearing ash, the decades of invention, the century of triumphs and setbacks, all the way to this ordinary Saturday in March 2026, when the city is once again doing what it does best: waking up, going to work, building tomorrow. This has been a journey of more than 40,000 words across 10 parts, a full 2-hour-plus documentary in spoken form, tracing one of the most dramatic and consequential rebirths in American history. Thank you, Riots, for staying with it from the first line to this last one, all the way from Dhaka. Now, as we close, I ask everyone listening or reading this, please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video from, whether it's Dhaka like Riots, Chicago itself, New York, London, Sydney, Lagos, Sao Paulo, or anywhere else on Earth, and tell us what time it is where you are right now. Drop a comment with your city and the local time. It's always incredible to see how far this story has traveled. And if you've enjoyed this deep dive into the Great Chicago Fire and Chicago's unbreakable spirit, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more long-form history narrations. Future videos will explore other great urban rebirths, forgotten disasters, architectural revolutions, and the people who refuse to let the flames have the last word. Thank you for listening, for learning, for remembering. The phoenix never stops flying. Chicago proves it every day, and so do cities and people everywhere. Until the next story, stay curious, stay resilient, and keep reaching for the sky.